folks are engaged in this history. That was a really appropriate message. I did want to let you all know that we will be recording this event and we will be posting it on the LACHA website. And so I'm really excited that you all are here to join us for Working People Organizing Against Authoritarianism. When the committee met last year, we met before the election and then after the election, and we thought it might be a good idea to bring us all together because we certainly would have something to say about the current political context. And we thought that both history and then contemporary organizing might give us some insight into the election that happened, and then even now, currently, the ways in which the current administration is running the government, and again, its effects on working people. And so we invited these wonderful panelists who will be introduced in a moment to share a little bit from their scholarly research and then also their contemporary either organizing or their perspectives about what is going on. And so what we'll do today is we will have a panel discussion that will be moderated by Professor Joe McCartin, who's an expert in U.S. labor, social, and political history, and a professor of history at Georgetown University, as well as the executive director at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, and then also the president of LACHA for 2024 and through 2026. He will moderate the panel and he will engage our panelists for discussion. And then after that, we will open the floor for Q&A from all of you. But what we will ask is that you put your questions and your comments in the chat so that we can keep everything organized and running smoothly. And so we'll be able to engage in that way. And so we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion, and then we'll have announcements related to LACHA, more events that will be coming up. So again, thank you so much for joining. Feel free to engage in the chat. We'll be putting questions and announcements in the chat, and we'll be asking you questions. And so feel free to engage in that way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor McCartin, who will take it from here. Thanks again.
Well, thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you for the work you've done to reorganize the Book Talk Committee and to set up this event. I cannot imagine a better way to be using our intellectual community at this, critical moment than bringing us together to talk about the stuff we're going to be discussing tonight. And we have a remarkable panel to dig into that discussion with us. I'm not going to go deeply into their extraordinary resumes because I think pretty much everybody here knows them. But of course, we're talking about Will Jones of University of Minnesota, Felicia Kornblue of Vermont, Nancy McLean of Duke, and Paul Ortiz of Cornell, some of our most illustrious members and people who have deep thoughts about what's going on now. So we're going to, ask them to help us make sense of this moment. Some people have referred to this as a coup. Others have talked about it being regime change. And there are other ways of categorizing what's going on, but I think one thing we can say is this is an extraordinary reactionary moment, perhaps unlike any that we've seen before. And so to come together as historians to try to make sense of it, I think is so important right now. So I'm going to ask our panelists to say something about themselves as they help us make sense of this moment first. So the question I'm going to ask each of them is briefly introduce yourself, share your intellectual, political, and professional commitments, and how they provide insight for you into understanding the current political landscape and its impact on working people. So that's our opening question. Let's start with you, Will.
Okay. Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Crystal and Faith, for organizing this. I think it's a really important conversation. I'm really looking forward to it and really appreciate everybody who's tuned in. So I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm also a former president of LACHA. I edit the up for debate section at Lodge's journal, Labor. And I'm also the president of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities chapter of the American Association of University Professors. And I want to talk a little bit about some thoughts from all of that work. Um, I guess just a few brief takeaways that I'd like to sort of start at the beginning. One is I think let's not be romantic about working class resistance to authoritarianism. We have a long and deep history of working class authoritarianism in the United States and in other parts of the world. And I think it's important that, we look at other places. I think there's a lot of sort of looking to European fascism, for example, when we have those models, both of authoritarianism and resistance to authoritarianism here in our own history. I was reminded last week, I was looking at an archive from the YMCA and their what they called Negro work in the 1940s, and Channing Tobias, a, a black activist, in his letters, he was referring to the new system of Jim Crow, and he used that term that they were implementing in South Africa. And I'm always reminded of how we refer to American apartheid, but they saw it as South African Jim Crow, and I think we need to remember that. Um, I think we should be clear at the same time that authoritarianism has had a devastating impact on working people and their communities, both economically and politically, and even, and in sometimes especially, those communities that actually supported it. So I think we need to recognize that dynamic. And that also, working people, when organized, have been some of the most powerful advocates for democratization. So a few things that I think come out of that. One is I've written a lot about the civil rights movement. I think an example that it's a movement that's often seen as a middle class movement, but its strength came from working class organizations, whether they were grassroots civil rights organizations, women's organizations, and labor unions that could articulate the concerns of working people and mobilize to realize them. I, A. Philip Randolph, the Black trade unionist, in 1945 gave the commencement address at Morehouse College, where Martin Luther King was a freshman at the time. He said, he urged the graduates of Morehouse to, quote, create a mental climate of service to the masses, to establish organic contact with the people in the shacks and the hovels. There resides the power. They may be poor in property, but they are rich in spirit. And I think that is a spirit that really animated a movement that I think is not often recognized, and one that we should take to heart. Um, It also, there's a lot of really great recent work on public workers, and I think that's particularly important right now. Jane Berger's great new book, a new volume edited by Eric Yellen and Frederick Gooding, a forthcoming collection by Mark Bayard on labor leader Bill Lucy. And I think one of the things that we can take away from this is the ways in which, particularly public employees, the attacks on public workers has had a double-edged impact on working class communities, as they are really critical places of employment, in some places with strong protections for unions that have transformed some of the most difficult and lowest paid work in our society into relatively stable family supporting jobs. But they also serve working class communities. And I think we've seen this in the recent protests against the federal budget cuts, and the lawsuits against the federal budget cuts, that public employees, for these reasons, are often on the front lines of defending both their own jobs and the services that we all rely upon. And then finally, just in closing, I think we should remember that as faculty, as students, as researchers, that this applies to us as well. We are public employees, right? And we need to embrace that status as both vulnerable and essential workers, and organize our own workplaces. Uh, I think we've seen in the recent budget cuts that even private universities are dependent upon public funds for almost everything that they do. And this last point, based on my work with the AAUP, we're working to expand our base on campus. I think it's really critical that we're working to expand outside of the humanities, where these types of organizations tend to be stronger, to ally with other unions on campus and across the state and nationally. And I think we need to, it's really essential that we organize at this point under whatever models are available to us, whether it's through formal collective bargaining or advocacy. So I think we need to be clear that we can't rely on administrators to defend us, our students, or our universities. They have different interests and different understandings of the problem. And we need to take responsibility for defending academic freedom and the core institutional values of our institution, but also our own economic situation and advancing that. So I hope that we can share some ideas for doing that tonight. And I really appreciate, again, you being here.
Thank you so much, Will. Let's turn to you, Felicia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Felicia Kornblue. I'm a professor of history and director of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Vermont, and I'm a former president of our local chapter, United Academics, which is affiliated with both AEUP, Collective Bargaining Congress, and American Federation of Teachers. And I would definitely second that about organizing on campus, even if you're on a private campus where organizing in an international trade union may not be possible. AEUP is really important right now. There was a little bit of talk about the media and new media opportunities as one side of pushback and resistance. And so the top line thing, the very first thing I want to say is that I've been writing since the election in November. I've been writing very regularly to connect some of my historical expertise with what's going on right now. First, I was just writing every day on Facebook out of a felt sense of need, internal sense of need. Someone suggested that I migrate that to Substack, where it would be more easy to share. So I did that around Thanksgiving, and I now am doing about twice a week, I'm posting something that I call History Teaches, in which I bring historical examples. Oh, thanks, someone put it in the chat, thank you. Where I bring historical examples that I know something about and engaged and into dialogue with what's going on right now. And I want to open that up to everyone. First of all, to say, if you want to have your own Substack newsletter, it's quite easy. Substack's a somewhat iffy corporation. Maybe you want to do, host it on one of the other options. That's also good. But also, I would love to have collaborators. If there's somebody who wants to write a one-day post on History Teaches, that would be fantastic. If you want to have a more sustained collaboration with me, I would love that as well. I'm really open and kind of looking at what the possibilities are of that form, especially at a time when we're seeing so many of the mainstream sort of corporate, publicly traded media organizations kissing the ring to Mr. Trump. Yeah, so please keep that in mind. I'm gonna go through very quickly some of the areas that have been foci of my research and connect those a little bit to what I'm seeing right now, instead of doing a big riff about my research to start with and then analyzing the current time. So I wrote 2 books about the history of social welfare and a bunch of articles, and also about organizing within the sphere of social welfare. And I guess I just have a couple of points about that. One is we're talking about working people's resistance, or the impact that they're experiencing, that we are experiencing in light of Trumpism. I'm just gonna underline that when I say working people, I also mean people who are beneficiaries of public benefit programs and people whose primary work is unremunerated, people who do caregiving and caretaking work for elders and children and others, disabled people, etc. I consider, all of us, except maybe people with a portfolio like Mr. Musk and Mr. Trump, to be working people and kind of under the aegis of people that we care about. I also think that there's still, although we're in this crisis time, I don't want to forget that there's still a lot of blame that can appropriately be accorded to the Democrats and to the mainstream of the Democratic Party for some of their moves to the center are really to the right, and the attacks that they made on public provision and the public bureaucracy. You know, I know there are a lot of people here who have written about neoliberalism and about NAFTA and the long-term impact of those kinds of policies. I've co-authored a book with political scientist Gwendolyn Mink about the welfare reform law of 1996 and the many subsequent chapters when mainstream Democrats and liberals could have renounced what happened in the 1990s. They could have stepped away from it. They could have stood up more forcefully for people who were racialized, marginalized, who were subject to the misogyny of that era, and they really haven't done it. There were like little moments when Obama was running in 2008 and he seemed to be saying something about turning the page after neoliberalism, and it never really happened. There was a little bit of a moment in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running, and I was sitting at home waiting for her to say welfare reform was a mistake, and it never happened. Although she did say that some elements of the crime bill had been a mistake, and that referring to young Black men as quote unquote super predators was a mistake. So I think if we try and understand how we get here, I think we have to remember that as well, even though it's uncomfortable. And at this moment, there's a great impulse to circle the wagons, and for everyone from kind of centrist liberals to their left to huddle together for warmth. I think we really lose something if we forget some of that history. So that's social welfare. There's a lot more to say about that. I've written a little bit about disability as well, related to the social welfare work. And in that, I just want to remind people of one thing that that may have slipped by you in this whole cascade. There are now 17 attorneys general who are trying to get the United States Supreme Court to say that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is unconstitutional. It was the first federal civil rights law before for disabled people, before the ADA. It's very important on campus in terms of ensuring access for disabled kids. It's very important in K through 12 education. That's just one example, but they are, without talking about it, they are coming for disability civil rights and disability social rights in a way that I think is being completely forgotten in the mainstream and is very devastating. And then more recently, I wrote a book about reproductive rights and reproductive justice. I think everybody knows some of what's happened around abortion. One thing that has not happened, which I think activists are interested in noticing, is that they have not decided to bring the Comstock Act back from the dead and use it as a way to immediately attempt to stop the transmission of information or of abortion pills through the mails. I mean, instead, they seem to be deciding to defund the whole post office, which is a different strategy for limiting people's access to mifepristone and misoprostol, which are the two drugs that are used in the abortion, the medication abortion regime. We may see them energize Comstock, but maybe not. And I think in that there's a lesson about effective organizing, even though it seems like that in abortion it's just a story of loss, loss, loss. Because actually a lot of people are paying attention to abortion, and so the hard right wingers, I think, they're hesitating a little bit about going after it through the front door, and there are a variety of backdoor ways that they're going at it. Of course, it's at some point somebody's going to try very aggressively to get the United States Supreme Court to say that fetuses are people under the 14th Amendment, and we'll see what happens with that. Mary Ziegler, my colleague, has a new book on that if anybody's interested. What's been lost, which I wrote a lot about in my last book, A Woman's Life as a Human Life, is reproductive justice, which is a much more expansive set of demands. And I would just urge us not to lose sight of reproductive justice, which is which goes well beyond abortion in terms of demands for reproductive autonomy, health rights, and genuine choice for all people in terms of their romantic and sexual and intimate lives. And then last, I'm doing a lot of work now on queer legal and civil rights. I'm writing a book about a pre-gay marriage state appellate case on same-sex intimacy, and I have a project on queer U.S. constitutional rights. We're going to do a special issue of the Journal of American Constitutional History, and we're going to do a conference on queer legal history at the American Society for Legal History in November. And you know, the queer community, the trans community, we are taking it on the chin so hard right now. I wrote my Substack this morning, and I'll just end on this. I said that if you think about some of the major historiography about the relationship between queer people and the state, what we're experiencing now is everything all at once. So it's the Margot Canaday world of a straight state where anti-queer repression is across state institutions. It's David K. Johnson's Lavender Scare. People are literally being fired because they talk about their queer, trans, and gay lives. It's what Mark Stein talks about when he talks about sexual injustice and how in some ways there's sexual progressivity, even at the same time as new lines of exclusion and repression are being drawn, especially around trans people. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Felicia. Let's go to you, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe, and good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy McLean. I'm a professor of history and public policy at Duke University. I'm also a past president of LACHA. Past presidents are well represented. And also I've been an activist for over decades now, working for victories or trying to protect past victories that the Trump administration aims to undo. So I just wanted to start with a little bit more level setting about where we are. What we are facing is an openly dictatorial president working with the wealthiest, least qualified cabinet in history and the world's richest man as an unelected co-president in a bid to roll back the 20th century for working people and for all the groups that make up the working class, you know, people of color, women, queer people, et cetera, immigrants. And I think it's also important to remember now that on the campaign trail, Donald Trump lied about Project 2025. He said he didn't know anything about it, wasn't going to do it. And the mainstream media, even though he had lied over 30,000 times, and then before they stopped counting, they accepted that as fact. And that's part of the reason we got here was the media handling of this election. Now we see the new administration implementing Project 2025 with breakneck speed and with absolute contempt for the Constitution. You know, they have both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court. They could pass legislation to achieve these things, but instead they're governing by fiat. And I also think it's important for us to keep in mind that these people are not just opponents on the issues. They have become morally depraved by their excessive wealth. They are seeking to turn the site of an ongoing genocide in Gaza into a luxury resort. The appalling, galling treatment of federal workers we've seen, where many people who have spent decades of life in service to the public and in doing things like protecting our air and water quality, our public health, you know, keeping us from nuclear meltdown, et cetera, all these good people were fired with ugly emails and have been insulted almost daily since this government came in. They are also seeking to separate, again, immigrant children from their hardworking parents, while this time Trump is proposing gold cards to lure ultra-rich foreigners to the U.S. for $5 million apiece. And they're openly, aggressively restoring racial segregation. Let's call it what it is. Racial segregation and exclusion and discrimination of every variety. All we have to do is look at the military brass firings and hirings to see this play out. They are governing like the authoritarian bullies overseas that they admire, through extortion and intimidation on a vast scale. And I think probably almost everyone on this call knows that their model is Viktor Orban's Hungary. So to the part of the question that's about our research and writing and commitments, and I have to say, as I was thinking about this, it's really eerie how precisely my research and writing speak to this authoritarian surge right now. My first book, Behind the Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, was a study of America's first mass fascist movement, the KKK of the 1920s, and which sadly just came out in a 30th anniversary edition because it so speaks to this moment. But if you go back and look at that, MAGA's ideology and tactics are so reminiscent of the KKK of the 20s, the reactionary populism, the white supremacy, the Christian nationalism, and really importantly, to what Felicia said, the exploitation of parental fears about changes in gender and sexuality among their kids as a tool to build a mass following for the whole agenda. Then I wrote Freedom is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace, which was about the struggle to open good jobs to all in America on the part of particularly African Americans in the Black Freedom Movement, then Mexican Americans, then women of all groups. And what I found in that work, I also looked at the movement conservatives' reaction to these struggles and found that at every single moment, they opposed every single measure to open up the workplace to all, to make things fair, to create inclusion. They opposed everything from the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action to the milquetoast diversity, equity, and inclusion policies we have now. And if going back to look at that, the rhetoric that we saw then and that I wrote about in Freedom is Not Enough is with us now. You know, this notion that this absolutely fictitious notion that they are eliminating diversity and equity and inclusion in order to bring back qualified people with merit, you know, like Pete Hegseth. So the most recent book, of course, is Democracy in Chains, which began with the attempt of segregationists abetted by economists to privatize the South's public schools after Brown versus Board of Education. And I discovered through that research how that campaign led these economists, these Mont Pelerin-style economists, to partnership with Charles Koch and the hundreds of organizations that he and his fellow donors have now funded to rig our legal system and our politics in favor of unaccountable corporations and multi-billionaires like Koch. And there's absolutely no way that Donald Trump would be president right now had it not been for that prior effort among the Koch network and all that they did in the 30 states controlled by Republicans. More recently, I just was given an investment prospectus from Koch's Americans for Prosperity group, which is their massive, you know, incredibly well-funded ground game. That was an article in The Guardian, I believe it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, but that shows how they are investing tens of $millions in Americans for Prosperity in a multi-pronged effort to pass Trump's top legislative priorities. So more tax cuts for billionaires, like those in his cabinet, to be paid for by taking away Medicaid and other crucial lifesavers from the people. And I think it's important in this Medicaid fight to realize that we're talking about 70 million people, right? 1 in every 4 Americans relies on Medicaid for health care, and they want to put that on the chopping block. So I think together these histories help explain both the deep roots and the accelerating impact of the right's embrace of authoritarian oligarchy. And this is crucial, and this is transnational among them, by the way, now, their use of Christian nationalists and fascist tactics to win popular backing for these policies that will only benefit, you know, the 0.1% of the population, and many of them wouldn't even agree with what's happening. So as historians, I think we have so much to contribute to the desperately needed public understanding of what is happening and why. And I think above all, and Will spoke to this too in his opening remarks, we need to reach those who didn't vote or who voted in frustration and over their fears of inflation and declining real income. We have to reach them with patient explanation of how this oligarch's administration is hurting them and all they care about, including their kids' futures, including their air and water quality, including their communities and job prospects, and so much more. So I will stop there and pass the baton to Paul.
Okay, Paul. Oh, you're muted, Paul.
For 5 years, I would remember to hit that mute button, but I
We
just hit.
noticed. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Latcha and the fabulous Dr. Crystal Moten. And Crystal did just a wonderful job in keeping us organized and feeling comfortable and confident. I have also been involved with Latcha for many years. I just want to do another shout out and really encourage everyone to join. I've been honored to be on the council a couple of times. And I just want to really just say again how honored I am to be here with such amazing colleagues and including all of you out there right now on the Zoom. So my background in the labor movement is that I taught at the University of Florida for 16 years. I was a former president of the United Faculty of Florida, AFL-CIO, the UF chapter. Many of you have read about our struggles in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Through our collective bargaining contract, we actually defeated Ron DeSantis on many different occasions. We lost a lot of battles. The war is still, who knows how that's going to turn out. But the thing I want to echo, what everyone has said so far, is why it is important to get organized right now. We were able to use collective bargaining to literally save gender studies and to save Black studies at the University of Florida. Without our union contract, those two departments would be gone. And I just want to echo something that my dear colleague Will Jones said earlier. Right now, I'm at Cornell University and professor of labor history. We don't have collective bargaining among the faculty, although the grad students recently unionized and they're negotiating their first contract. I just want to share with all the faculty out there, it's so critical to support our grad students right now in their organizing efforts. Please support them. This is the only way we're going to save intellectual freedom in higher education or on any level, is to get unionized. And I know a lot of folks may not have come from union backgrounds, but if you it doesn't really matter if you did or not. What matters is now. I came up through the labor movement. I was involved with my wife, Sheila, who many of you know, in the Chateau Saint Michel wine boycott with the United Farm Workers in the late 80s and early 90s. And it was really there where I learned the power of collective solidarity. I recently actually, and let me actually start with, or kind of go on to a victory that I don't want us to forget, because we've had a lot of defeats. My colleagues and panelists have mentioned some of those, and we'll have more defeats. But we've also achieved a great victory. And I've learned more about this victory. I was asked by the Labor Studies Journal folks to write a piece about Latino workers in the 2024 presidential election. And I've had the chance in writing that piece to talk to labor activists in Denver and other parts of the country. In the middle of writing this piece, of course, the head of ICE was fired. Because you remember that Donald Trump promised 10 million deportations of immigrant workers before the election. And he campaigned on that promise. And he has not been able to keep that promise because of labor solidarity. Latino workers, what I've discovered in this piece, and I'll share a couple just very brief excerpts with you, is that Latino workers and their allies in cities like Los Angeles, like Denver, like Chicago, the list goes on, have been able to mobilize a kind of solidarity that in many cases we haven't even seen since the Great Depression. Cross-class coalitions, people who are stopping ICE agents, people who have networks, intelligence networks that are building up. We have this in Middle State New York, by the way. We know the moment that an ICE agent comes into our small town of Ithaca, New York. We know the moment that Secret Service people are coming in to attack immigrant workers. We know where they eat lunch at. We know where they stay. We know what hotels. And by the way, they're mainly staying, these ICE agents are mainly staying at 4- and 5-star hotels. That doesn't sound like they're saving money for us. But the important point here is that if you look at the resistance to the federal ICE, to the resistance to Trump's anti-immigration policies, this is being led by the Latino working class and their allies. And one of the exciting things as a scholar of African-American history and Latino history is to be able to share with folks that many of the counties where the resistance against Trump's anti-immigration policies are the strongest were also kind of sanctuary counties during the anti-slavery movement, including my own Ithaca, including Tompkins County. These were communities where white folks came out with guns, in some cases, to defend formerly enslaved African Americans from being re-enslaved by U.S. And other federal agents. So there's a great kind of historical continuity here. One of the things we need to remember, I think we need to also think about the next steps too. So we've had a few victories. We just had an amazing organizing meeting here in Tompkins County, which is mainly a rural county. It's where Cornell University is sited. We're the state's land grant university. A lot of folks don't know this, but it's mainly an agricultural area. We had almost 1,000 people at this indivisible meeting of people who are joining the struggle. And that's I think I hope our main takeaway tonight is join the struggle, because people are already fighting. They're no longer waiting. But I also want to close on the point of we need to also think about the next steps. To echo my dear colleague Felicia, we can't wait on a political party, especially the Democrats, to be on the front lines for us. They supported the Lake and Riley Act. That's abysmal. That's retrograde. We need to think about how we build new types of coalitions, how we have each other's backs, how we can come to the aid of our neighbors in need. If we can do these things, we'll win this struggle. Ethnic studies scholars often teach our students that, quote, this house was not built for us. This is the same thing I think that historians should be doing with U.S. history writ large. We need new types of institutions. It's clear that the Supreme Court wasn't built for us. The U.S. Senate wasn't built for us. The executive, we've had all this talk about checks and balances. We know what it means now. It's checks and balances against us. We're the people who are the threat if we're organized democratically. So I think that one of the things historians can do is really, share stories of past triumphs, but also past defeats. Let's be candid. Cautionary tales, inspiring moments of struggle. Our voices are needed more than ever. And especially, we're needed more than ever to join in with Latino workers in these cities, in Dallas, in Denver, in Seattle, and places that have really stopped ICE dead in the tracks. So let's get involved in the struggle, and we'll continue to build our own campus organizations. Again, we have a really, we'll be glad to know we have a growing chapter of American Association of University Professors at Cornell. We've doubled our membership in recent months. And that's what we need to continue doing at this time and moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Great comments to open this up. I want to invite people to think about questions you'd like to ask. You can drop them in the chat. Is that right, Faith? So go ahead and do that. While you're doing that, and while you're thinking about what you want to ask, I wanted to take one quick run through again of all our panelists and just ask them very briefly. And Paul, you already spoke to this. Maybe we can start with you. What gives you the most hope at this moment? What do you see as the most effective things going on?
Well, I think the thing that gives me the most hope, Joe, is that, we have, it isn't just the old timers, like us who are getting involved, it's younger people. And on campus, one of the things that our AAUP chapter has been doing is, our university administrators have been, and I've talked about this in other contexts, where I feel in some cases we brought a lot of this pain on ourselves. We academics, we allowed contingency to rise. We allowed adjunctification to rise. Our professional associations didn't fight hard enough against this. But I see this generation of graduate students now getting organized. And it gives me a tremendous amount of hope, because they're coming together and they're saying, this should be being a teacher and instructor at a college, community college, a university should be a good job. It should be at least, you should be able to pay your bills. But you should be there for your students. And that's the thing that gives me inspiration is we have a newer generation of grad students who are coming in and through LACHA, again, I think LACHA, I want to give us credit too, because again, the people on the Zoom call, we're the people who actually like teaching. We're the people that spend time with our students. We're the people that are on campus after 5 p.m. I know this, I know many of you with student organizations. We're the faculty advisors for ethnic studies associations, but we're also the faculty advisors for new groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, Students for Justice in Palestine. And so we're there for our students. And that's the thing those are the things that really give me hope. Joe, I hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
No, Paul, thank you. That's great. Nancy, how about you? What gives you hope?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll say what gives me hope is that there is now an emerging opposition that we can see, that's holding demonstrations, that's being public, and that is having an effect and drawing support. So I want to point to 4 things that I'm most familiar with, and that also that all of you can sign up with, and I will drop links in the chat after I describe them. But first of all, Democracy 2025, if you don't know about this group, if you haven't signed up yet, just look it up, and well, I'll send you the link, but you can sign up easily. But they were preparing for Project 2025 all along with a threat matrix. They right out of the gate are litigating on multiple fronts with multiple partners. They have over 1,000 cooperating attorneys, over 300 organizations that are part of their coalition. And all of this litigation, as you know, litigation is slow. It's problematic in many ways, but it has led to injunctions. It has stopped things from happening, and it is slowing down the pace of this rush toward authoritarianism. So I'm really an avid supporter of this effort and encourage you all to find out about it too. And another thing is they are always looking for plaintiffs. They have to find plaintiffs who can show harm, i.e. federal workers, research scientists, kids who've lost their parents. All of these things, they need faces and people and stories. So thinking about the people that who are affected by the things this administration is doing illegally, and sharing that information could be really, really helpful. A second thing, most of us on this call, for better or worse, are in the education space, and there is a lot of organizing and educating going on and to be done, as Paul was suggesting, and Will is doing at University of Minnesota. So the AEUP, I think many people know, is now merged for its union locals with AFT Higher Ed, and they're doing terrific work in many places, as Paul was laying out. But also the AEUP has new leadership across the board, including the wonderful Bethany Latique, who I know from fighting the Koch network at George Mason, is heading the advocacy chapters and really starting to bring organizing to life there. So anyone who is not on this call, who is not a member of AEUP, I really beg you to join, because the dues you pay will be supporting the organizing that many others are doing. As part of that, I'm involved with an effort called the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom at the AEUP. I'm one of about 15 fellows there, and we're doing a whole range of things. But among other things, I want to point out here, we are we have, I think, 7 or 8 now done, an executive power watch for all the, executive orders that the Trump administration is doing and the governing by fiat. We take those, the ones affecting higher education, take them and break them down and show what they are doing, who it will harm, who it will benefit, and most importantly, how you can fight back. So I will drop that link in the chat too, but that's something to really know about, and I hope share with others. There is also a labor-based effort to fight back against all this, led by someone known to many of you, I think, Bill Fletcher, and Dan Schlederman, who has a long background in the labor movement. It's called Standing for Democracy, and that is starting to take shape and build out with a number of unions and labor folks. And lastly, the thing that gives me the most joy is getting off the defensive, not being reactive, and going on the offense. And that is taking the fight away from places where we are on the defensive to Elon Musk. The Tesla dealership protests. If you have not paid attention, it will warm your heart. Google those 3 words, Tesla dealership protests. They've gone on in Seattle, in Oklahoma, in Indiana, in Illinois, all over the place. And, it's really easy to do, because Tesla dealership, you can look up locations in your state and organize your people. And what better way to spend a Saturday than deterring people from further enriching Elon Musk? So those are my 4 things, and I'll drop links.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Felicia.
I'll drop some links too. I wanted to underline the idea that our campuses are meaningful sites of protest. So I think they're places where we learn to think about the rest of the world, but they also these are places where democracy is being challenged right now, and our ability to think and learn and challenge mainstream verities, what the Trump administration is trying to circulate as truth. They hate us for a reason. They hate universities and they hate professors and everyone in the intellectual community. They hate us for a reason because we are a critical site of resistance and we have to save it. I heard a great talk by Asli Bali of Yale Law School on my campus about a week and a half ago. Bali has been doing Know Your Rights presentations for students who are participating in the pro-Palestinian protests, but more generally as somebody working with the AEUP on civil rights and civil liberties at this moment on campus. So you might check her out, look at some of the YouTube videos, and as everyone else was saying, also stay involved with your AFT and your AEUP chapters. So that's thing one. Secondly, particularly about gay, queer, and trans issues, history itself is a vital site of contest right now. They are taking down history pages, they're taking down informations about the gay and queer past. One thing that people are doing that is a meaningful form of activism is just copying pages, thousands and thousands of pages from the National Park Service sites where they're literally censoring the past. Wendy Rouse, a historian some of you may know, wrote a great piece about the queer history of the women's suffrage movement, the quote unquote women's suffrage movement. And they attempted first to rewrite it against her will. And when she protested, they simply took it down. And this is happening across federal websites right now, especially for anything having to do with trans people or recognizing their history. But it's not going to stop there. So I would say, everyone, please support Out History. Editor-in-Chief Mark Stein, they're doing vital work to keep our histories alive, and to some degree, you know, by letting us learn our histories, keeping us alive. Also the LGBTQ plus History Association, which is organizing, it's just been doing a series of listening sessions with people to find out what our experiences are. Please, 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 those groups need your support, they need your dues. And those of us who are queer in the Academy right now, I mean, I have tenure, I'm a senior person, but even I'm pretty freaking scared. And people who are trans identified are really scared. So, you know, do it with your dollars, do it with your words, and just be a friend to anybody you know who's gay, queer, trans, non-binary, intersex right now. It's really scary. And then, what's the last thing I wanted to say? Oh, there are a couple things that I see locally. One is we have a group called Rights and Democracy, and we also have a worker center that's outside of the unions. Those institutions have been very important, and we have a progressive party in Vermont as well, a third party. Any formation that's outside of the two-party system, I think is very meaningful right now to pull the Democrats and make the Democrats stay on their liberal left social democratic game as much as possible. They are going to sell out trans people. They are going to sell out immigrants if they can. They are going to sell out Black people and gay people, I think, and working class people's organizations. And we have to build organizations so that they can't do that. And the last thing I'll say locally that I've observed is this group called Third Act, which is national, but it started here because Bill McKibben, who teaches at Middlebury College, who's a famous environmentalist and writer and professor, is one of the founders with Rebecca Solnit and others. It's mostly for people who are over 65, I think, or maybe over 60.
Higher. Yeah.
65? Is it? So some of you qualify, even if you don't. If you're doing any kind of activism, I would say look up Third Act. There's a lot of baby boomers out there, some of whom are retired and have time on their hands, some of whom have a lot of experience and financial resources and other things they can contribute to the struggle. So do work with Third Act and other organizations like that, and bring some of the retireds and the boomers into your movement. Thanks.
Thank you, Felicia. Will.
Yeah, it's great to hear all these things going on, and I guess I'll name a few things. I think, echoing Paul's point, it was really the first really large protests in response to the things happening in Washington came from an immigrant rights group in the Twin Cities that organized a massive march when really there had not been any real protests, and it was really important. I think that was where it was located and where it was coming from, and the effect that it had on people's spirits. Couple things other things that give me hope. Also echoing, I think it was Paul who mentioned graduate students. The graduate students at the University of Minnesota signed their first contract in January, and they won that really in the face of really stiff resistance from the administration in the fall, that they really pushed back on with 2 strike threats that one of which was a really risky strike threat, and they did it and won a really important contract. And I think it reiterates that they now have legal protections that frankly faculty don't have, right? Because they have a collective bargaining contract. The AAUP organizing on our campus has been driven mostly by non-tenure track faculty who are again looking to collective bargaining for what the equivalent of tenure protections that in this moment are really critical, and they're sort of dragging the tenure track faculty along. And I think is I think indicative of what the way these things often play out. We held a great town hall last week. We had over 200 people come out to talk about the response to the executive orders, the threats to LGBTQ and non-citizen community members, the threats to research funding, and the threats to academic freedom. And I think being able to link all of those and make an argument that these are all part of similar struggles and we need to be together on them gave me a lot of hope. I'm also, given a lot of hope on the national level that I think we've seen particularly unions step up, and these coalitions of unions that have organized the protests, but I think just as importantly, the lawsuits again that have successfully stopped many of or halted, we'll see where they stand, but I think made a really important impact on the pausing the firing of federal employees, the attacks on teaching DEI, the attacks on research funding that have been blocked by several coalitions of unions, the AFGE, the AFT, AAUP, the United Electrical Workers, Democracy Forward, which is an organization that's played a really important networking role in Washington. And I've put a bunch of these links in the chat, but to Higher Education Labor United and Labor for Higher Ed, which has been doing a series of national calls and national mobilizations, again, which is a coalition of organizations and unions that I think have really made a tremendous impact in the past few weeks, and I think really need our support. So again, as Nancy pointed out, joining these organizations means that your dues are going to go to fund this fight back, and it's really important that we do that. So thanks.
Thank you all. Now we've got about a half hour for more interchange. So there's a number of questions that have been asked in the chat. I think the best way to do this is I'm going to put out each question, but just ask one of you to volunteer on that one. Then otherwise we won't get to every question, I think. But the first one's from Rosa Greenwood. Is there an example from history that you think is insightful to understanding the current struggles in the U.S.? Does anybody want to take that?
Well, I think any one of us could take it. Let me just jump in so my computer doesn't go on sleep mode. But I think I'm going to call out one of my dear colleagues who I saw earlier on the Zoom, who we're bringing to Cornell University, the ILR school next week, Professor Dana Frank, who just completed an amazing book. What can we learn from the Great Depression? This book that Professor Frank has written is so critical to the moment that we live in today. And one of the things that she points out is that it isn't just the CIO, these national leaders we've known about for years. It isn't Franklin Roosevelt. It isn't Francis Perkins even. It's the grassroots energy. It's neighbors helping neighbors. It's people helping other people from being abused, from being deported. Those grassroots struggles during the Great Depression really did save this nation from going full fascist. I mean, I'd just be very candid as a labor historian. I just taught the U.S. Labor History Survey last semester at Cornell, and all these other nations, Spain, Germany, Italy, become full fascists. They transitioned into Nazism. The first thing that the Nazis do, of course, or the fascists do, is they crush the trade union movement. They incarcerate and brutalize LGBT people, communists, and others. And I think that, again, what can we learn from the Great Depression? Professor Frank's book is really a great primer. But again, so many of you out there are writing these great primers as well. The other question I want to address too is, how can we get our messages out? And I know a lot of people here have also worked on Who Built America over the years. I just want to thank people so much, my colleagues, because this is how I learned how to teach the U.S. History Survey as a working class centered survey, was using that first edition of Who Built America. I was honored to work on the fourth edition. I wrote the epilogue essay for that edition, and it's an open resource. And I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Michelle Chen, for putting the correct URL in the linkage, because I put the incorrect one. But that is a resource, y'all, from colonial period, from slavery, from Reconstruction, the Great Depression, the Gilded Age, the New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great resource to get out there. And I do a lot of work with public educators and school districts. And I find that not every school district, but a lot of them are so hungry to get this type of history, because they're moving into minority majority school districts. They want a new type of history. And it's out there. It's below the radar, but there's more hunger. And it's really easy. The last thing I'll say, it's the younger people. It's their hunger for ethnic studies, for LGBT, for non-cisgendered studies, that is really causing a lot of anger among these MAGA people. I mean, that's why MAGA rose up as a movement. And we just have to counter that. And that's why we have to be there when these struggles break out.
Thank you, Paul. The next question sort of aimed toward you, Nancy. This is from Deborah R. For Nancy and or others, since the model for Trump is Hungary and other dictatorships, what, if anything, can we learn from what has mobilized labor and workers in those locations? And related, any specific roles for global labor solidarity coordination? Are you?
Oh, that's interesting. The situation in Hungary is pretty dire now, as I understand it. So it's really an example of why we want to get active now to prevent our falling into this state. But I mean, everything that Donald Trump is doing, and they've said it, like Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation, had Viktor Orban to the Heritage headquarters last March. And after that meeting, he said, Viktor Orban is not just a model for conservative governance. He is the model, and think about it. What was the model of Orban? He started as a neoliberal, couldn't get traction, lost election, then came back using anti-Semitism and Christian nationalism to ride to office. Once he got into office, he cowed the media. He purged the civil service. He changed the laws and changed the Constitution to lock in power. So this is the model that they are following, and it's a really troubling one. Poland is actually an interesting story, that Poland was actually able to reclaim their government from the Law and Justice Party, the kind of proto-fascist party. But I think they're still struggling with the legal and constitutional changes that party put into effect. And I don't know if there was any particularly strong role of the labor movement. I do know that there was a very broad coalition, and that the attacks on women and on reproductive rights really mobilized a lot of people to take back their government. I want to point to one thing though. Brazil. Too bad my colleague John French, the Brazilianist, is not here, because Brazil is really an example, right, of reclaiming. That there was a constitutional coup that drove Dilma Rousseff from power, and a false case against Lula that led to his jailing by a corrupt court and getting, out of the election. So Bolsonaro was able to run. We now know Bolsonaro is facing charges because he tried to do what Trump did, and overthrow the Lula government. But here's a couple of interesting things. One is, thanks to it being a Workers' Party, government, the Lula government, their working class and unions are so mobilized. I happened to be speaking with Bill Fletcher at the first convention of National Nurses United after the COVID pandemic, and learned that during the pandemic, they had reached out to nurses across the world, created something called Global Nurses United. They had people from 38 countries at their convention in California when we were there. And one of the people who spoke was the leader of the Brazilian affiliate of Global Nurses United. She told us that if Bolsonaro had tried to pull a Trump, they had 50,000 trade unionists ready to go out on the streets in Rio de Janeiro alone, right? 50,000 trade unionists who would have blocked that. So that is very aspirational. That is not where we are. And I think, as people were saying with the Democratic Party leadership, it is the same thing with the labor movement. The labor leadership, I kind of disagree with Will on this. They were really frightened and didn't want to do very much at all, and were leery of some of the efforts of people to organize. I think it's their own members' outrage and the wider public outrage, and now the fact that, they're threatened with mass firings, et cetera, that has lit a fire. But there's still, they're kind of demonstrations. I'm not sure that it's aggressive as it could or should be. And I think the way to get there is for rank and file union members to become much more vocal, to organize their workplaces, to put pressure on their leadership to lead. Exactly as someone was saying, I think maybe it was Paul just now, that we've got to put pressure on our university leaders to lead, because right now they are cowering. They are afraid of their endowments. They are afraid of losing all those STEM grants, that make up a huge part of their budgets. And so they're not even providing basic information for faculty. So that's actually, by the way, and this is straying from the question about workers, but this is one of the things that I'm doing with a colleague at Duke, is to provide an informational forum on what the Trump administration is going to mean for our campus, right? And I think that's a way to get a lot more people involved, is to talk about the specific harms to them and to things like, cancer research, or students with disabilities, or, immigrant students, and to really have these public conversations that, again, will start to create the ferment that pushes our leaders to lead, because otherwise I don't think that they're going to.
Thank you, Nancy. Matt Simmons is asking, what can be done to cut through all the disinformation and general noise, particularly when young folks are getting their facts on TikTok and other forms of social media? And what are some lessons there might be from past organizing about how to get the message out? Anybody want to handle that?
I think that it is very hard. TikTok I don't worry about as much, but if you look at the data and the degree to which, for example, young white men in particular, have been organized intellectually and, in a sense, culturally by the misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, etc., pseudo-populist alternative media, it's pretty severe. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but if you add up all the far right podcasts, the most obvious ones, and their listenership, and you compare to the most obvious and well listened to liberal left social democratic podcasts, we're outnumbered maybe 4 to 1. And I think one thing that we can all do as culture workers is we can add more information to that ecosphere. I've been writing for everybody in the last few years since I started working kind of full-time on repro issues. I write for Ms.com. They don't pay you anything, but they're quite open if you're doing something about gender and sexuality. I've been writing for the American Prospect, which is, left social democratic, founded by scholars like Paul Starr at Princeton. I've been writing for the New York Review. I've been trying and trying and trying to get op-eds into the mainstream places. I guess the Washington Post isn't going to be a place where one can even try that anymore, but the New York Times and others. And I started my own thing. And I post on Facebook and every other medium that's available to me. No reason we can't be on TikTok. There's no reason we can't be adding more all the time to this surround. I had a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine who's a consultant who helps people raise money to make films. And I'm starting work on that. What can I do in film and video? I have another friend who's a historian. We're talking about forming a production company so that we can bring alternative histories to a variety of mainstream modes. We had a great conversation with Heather Thompson, who I'm sure everybody knows her work. She has a company that does consultancy with film and video projects and with history museums and others. There are a lot of interesting kind of emergent models out there for how we can further true stories and also accurate analysis of what's going on right now. And I think that, in a sense, is the easy thing for us to do, although in some ways it's not easy because it requires doing things that people who usually publish peer-reviewed scholarly research in journals may not be accustomed to. But it's not as hard as you might think to write for a wider audience. That's what I found anyway. It goes pretty fast. And there's a great hunger. The good thing about alternative media is that it's sort of a huge maw, absorbing constant amounts of content and information. I think sometimes it's hard for readers to sort out the wheat from the chaff, but we can at least add a lot more wheat. So we're not gluten intolerant. We can add more true stuff. And we certainly can add more real history that informs this moment.
Thank you, Felicia. So this is from Michelle Chen. Outside of academia, it appears that many, if not most, Americans lack a deep understanding of labor and working class history, part due to deliberate policy choices that limit teaching of history. Can you discuss how historians can make interventions in the public sphere in terms of popular ed and K through 12 institutions, ensuring that history is taught in a meaningful way that reaches everyday people? Will?
Oh, yeah, I'll take that. I mean, I think we've actually seen in the past decade or so the emergence of a lot more attention to labor stories in the press, and the emergence of great labor journalists like Michelle Chen and others who have really, I think, worked in these stories into places where they haven't been a lot of. I think Kim Kelly's another one who has really brought these stories into places where they hadn't been before, and I think we owe a lot. And it's really important in a moment like that to have people doing that. I think I wish that there were more people working in the being hired by big newspapers, and but it's great that we have this press. So I think part of what the answer is to really support people like Michelle who are doing really great work, and of course teach our classes and publish for whoever will read our work.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Could
Will.
I add a little thing onto that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the AHA has been doing a really good job of bringing in K through 12 teachers, and community college teachers. So I think that's another thing that maybe, LACHA could think about is, among the kind of panels where people present scholarship, but maybe to organize some teaching panels about labor history that are particularly pitched to K through 12 and or community college teachers, because I think there's a real hunger among people to do this kind of reporting. And there was a push, before this giant, lurch to the right to get labor history requirements, in many state school curricula. And by the way, the right is really, like, for 2025, they're going whole hog after general education requirements, to change those at the state level, to try to eliminate all the kinds of things that people have been talking about here tonight. So I think finding other pathways, direct pathways to K through 12 and community college educators is going to be really important.
Yeah.
You know, Joe, can I just add
Well,
to that? I think it's important that we work with with K to through 12 unions. I think actually my
Yeah.
friend Jeanette Corselius is on this call, and she works with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, and she does really great programming for teachers, but she often draws on me and Peter Ratcliffe and other labor historians to work with teachers. So I think that's I think a resource that we need to really take advantage of and support.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will, and glad you're here, Jeanette.
If I could add on to that too, this is kind of a wonderful thread, and maybe even combine that with a couple of the other questions. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, that the way is open for us to contribute. And I was one of those kids that grew up, I knew, even though I grew up in a shipyard town, which was heavily unionized, I mean, we took unions for granted. We didn't know anything how they've been organized. We didn't know any of those traditions that had built the working class. But the way is open now. I think I see a couple of colleagues who were involved. We helped in the state of Connecticut create a new African American, Latino, Puerto Rican curriculum just a few years ago. The thing to remember is, again, the energy. See, I've taught like the Chicano blowouts and the creation of ethnic studies for years and years and years. In the 60s, so much of the energy was in the high schools and colleges, and it's there, y'all. It is there. Younger people, their parents, their teachers want a more small d democratic history. They're tired of the top-down stuff. They're tired of the Alexander Hamilton-centric story. And this is why oral history has enjoyed an incredible resurgence. This is why labor history has enjoyed an incredible resurgence. So the way is open for us to participate. A couple other questions, about political strikes and boycotts. Yes, by all means necessary. In the piece that I just finished for Labor Studies Journal, it's strikes, hunger strikes. People are waging hunger strikes at this very moment. They're waging boycotts. Especially Hispano-Hispanic businesses are joining with Latino workers, and they're shutting down entire weeks in some cases in protest. Because as my dear colleague Stephen Zunas has taught us from USF, this is what nonviolence is. It's not non-controversial. It's shutting the system down when there's an injustice that the government refuses to acknowledge or to deal with. So yeah, we are at the time now where we have to get involved in direct action. And the intelligence networks, to address Major Major's question, they're being created everywhere. I would be surprised if you're in a community that doesn't have one. Just kind of ask around, you'll find one. In my first book, Emancipation Betrayed, I learned that African Americans in the Deep South, when they had an NAACP meeting in 1919, y'all, they didn't put it in the newspaper, because the people that Nancy McLean writes about would have shut that stuff down. So the stuff is happening everywhere. And don't be isolated. Don't be fearful. That's what the man wants us to be. He wants us to be fearful. He wants us to be alienated. He wants us to feel alone. Get involved. Me, even as a movement historian, going to that indivisible meeting in Tompkins County last week was really affirming. It was just really cool to be with people who are like, wow, this is really messed up, and we're going to do something about it. There's no substitute for that kind of energy.
Thank you, Paul. Since we're down to our last 12 minutes or so, I'm going to read a few questions and then just leave it open to which ones you all want to pick up on. This is from Jane Berger. A lot of higher ed institutions are pre-complying with things like the Dear Colleague letter that we all know about. What can we do to empower colleagues across the nation to resist their administration's predilection to pre-compliance? So that's from Jane. Danielle Phillips Cunningham asks, she's curious to know panelists' thoughts about racism and fascism. Many people voted their race or what they aspire to be. Many people who voted for Trump were not truly worried about the price of eggs and bread. And then from Major, Paul spoke eloquently about defensive intelligence networks, like the long civil rights movement. Any ideas about how freelance intellectuals can help working people and collective groups take the offensive against SCOTUS. And then one final one from Bob Bussell. Any thoughts on moving toward political strikes and boycotts as a means of mounting public opposition that imposes economic consequences on the regime and its cronies? So panelists, anybody want to respond to any of those? Felicia.
Yeah, I'll start off for this round, and thank you for all those questions. I'm going to pick up on the pre-compliance and the higher ed. What I think that is a great danger. I was in a faculty meeting last Friday in the history department, and we were talking about our, strategy for trying to recruit somebody. We have a fellowship program university-wide called the Harris Henderson, which is for non-traditional faculty, usually faculty of color. And the interim chair of the department said, as a matter of course, well, we're going to proceed with this until they tell us we can't, right? Until somebody above us says it's illegal. And then, we'll act as though it is illegal. I have to say, as a socio-legal historian, that's not how it works. The more we act like something is illegal, the more it is illegal. The more we act like something is legal, the more it is legal. Law's not a fact. It never has been. Anyway, that's what I teach my undergraduates and my graduate students. But I think there is a great danger. What I'm trying to do right now is to work both inside and outside. We have a liberal administration. The interim president has set up a whole set of what she's calling teams of teams to try and analyze and counter the threat from the Trump administration from the various things. I'm on the diversity one that's about anti-Semitism, and I didn't even talk about this, but the enormous threat that people who are engaged in what's perceived to be anti-Israel speech, which is classified as anti-Semitic speech, are going to be deported, or God knows what they have in mind. And I'm with all the DEI people on that. So I think that's important. I think it's important for us to work with the administration as we can. And I also think it's important to use that as an opportunity for us to be in dialogue with each other. Like, I desperately want Jewish studies and Jewish identified faculty to be working with everyone else who's concerned about issues of race and ethnicity and nationality and religion and subordination and discrimination. Like, we all need to be in this together. So working with the administration as we can and for as long as we can, and at the same time working on the outside. Inside the union, we have a somewhat revivified civil rights committee within our union. It's not great, but also I think we need to create some new stuff. We need to create some separate opportunities for conversation and organizing. So I think that's the way we play it, at least where we have liberal administrations and not openly hostile administrations. Like, they're going to go down the road with us to a certain degree and be on our side in terms of, opposing the quote unquote anti-DEI initiatives and the quote unquote anti-Semitism initiatives. However, at a certain point, what I anticipate is that they'll jettison us and, or at least some of us, and try and preserve what they perceive as their institutional well-being. So I think we need to have an inside-outside strategy going. Thanks.
Thank you, Felicia.
So
Nancy?
I'll jump in and say a little bit more from where I am about the pre-compliance, and then also the question of voting and the racism in the voting. So in the pre-compliance, how to stop, I just want to share this with anybody who hasn't read Tim Snyder's little book on tyranny, which happens to be right by my desk here. The number one lesson is do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. And then he says anticipatory obedience is a political tragedy. But anticipatory obedience is what many universities are doing right now because they're concerned about their endowments and all those financial reasons. So what can we do about that? I think Philadelphia, it's, actually it didn't stop them because it already happened, but I put a link in the Q&A that UPenn was shamed by Philadelphia politicians, particularly African-American, elected officials, for capitulating on DEI. I think the sooner we get ahead of this, the harder it's going to be for them to do the anticipatory obedience. So similarly to our university over the summer, kind of stealthily changed the pickets, protest, and demonstrations policy to make it much more punitive, and then had an event that I think of as entrapment, at which now 5 students and 2 faculty members are facing a judicial board for disrupting an Israeli government speaker. And so a group of faculty from the Human Rights Center here and elsewhere, we're organizing a faculty letter kind of in defense of protest. And we've got, I think, like about 90 signatures now. We want to get to 100 before we go out. But I think anything that we can do to get ahead of this and put the heat on and move the pressure to the left rather than capitulating to the right is really important. I do want to say something about this question of voting, because absolutely no question, the MAGA hardcore, which is about half the Republican Party and about 1/3 of our population, that hardcore is deeply racist, is deeply patriarchal, is deeply committed to the whole ugly MAGA bag. But the fact of the matter in this election is that there were 19 million Biden voters in 2020 who didn't go out to vote. Many of them were frustrated because their weekly household earnings were going down while Democrats were telling them that their hourly wages were going up. There's a great piece by Tom Ferguson at INET. If you haven't seen it, look for it. The Democrats were awful on this, and then campaigned with Liz Cheney, war criminal, Bill Clinton, who passed NAFTA in Michigan. There were a lot of mistakes made in that, as valiant as Kamala Harris was, and how as beautifully as she fought the campaign. There were a lot of problems. And there were a lot of people who were just really frustrated. People just see a system they don't like. And if we don't reach those voters, we are handing them over to fascists, right? So the judgmental and condemnatory and self-righteous stuff that goes on so much on the left, this is not helpful. We have to create off-ramps for people. And we're seeing this already. There are farmers in deep red territory outraged at the cuts that they're seeing from Elon Musk. There are Republicans who are joining Democrats in outraged town hall meetings about Republicans saying, this is not what I voted for. Jamil Bouie has been brilliant on this, saying, like a lot of people voted for Trump, or at least saying they were voting on these economic issues. Now he's going through with the most radical agenda that they didn't want. So we have an incredible opening here, and I hope that we do not blow it, because if we don't reach the people that we can reach, including that 19 million votes we left on the table, we're doomed.
Thank you, Nancy. We've got about 2 minutes each for Paul and Will with final thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think, Felicia, I think you had responded in the chat to Omar, somebody's very important question. And I think this gets us to, I mentioned earlier with the AAUP, our union chapter at Cornell and I see some of my dear Cornell colleagues on the Zoom tonight. One of the things we're doing, even though we don't have collective bargaining rights, is we're acting like a union does. And a union is there for the students, for the community. And so we have been at just about every judicial meeting or hearing where our administration is trying to punish or to expel students, many of them Muslim, also many of them members of Jewish Voices for Peace, frankly, many of them graduate student union members. We have to be there in solidarity whenever any member of our community is being persecuted. And, in a broader sense, the victories that we won, to the extent that we won victories in Florida, were because we always had been there as a union for our students, for our surrounding communities. We have to understand that our universities pull surplus wealth out of our surrounding community. It isn't just corporations that exploit workers, it's universities, it's colleges, it's campuses, right? And this is a role that graduate and faculty lecturer unions can play, is to remind our administrations that we get much more out of our surrounding communities than they actually get out of us. I mean, I'm just going to be very candid from a labor economics perspective. So no one will come to help us. No one will care a whit about academic freedom or tenure or any of these issues unless we are there next week at a local school board meeting. Nancy, at our panel AHA, you taught us, you reminded us, be there at your next school board meeting when people try to ban books. Be there at the next city council meeting. You can't be at every one of them, but make sure someone in your union or organization is there to advocate for K through 12 teachers, to advocate for undocumented workers. If your town is a sanctuary town, make sure it keeps that status. If it isn't, form an intelligence network. But again, there's so many things we can do as organized people to fight the mess that we're in right now.
Paul, Will, final words?
Yeah, I mean, I want to, the question that Danielle raised, I think, is the one that I was referring to at the beginning, that I think we can't be naive or romantic about working class authoritarianism, and it's real. And I think part of what Nancy's point is right about the importance of, I mean, the importance of democratization, that we need to make sure that people have access to the right to vote, and that includes people of color, but also, white workers who might side with people of color, but that it's going to be that 1/3, that hardcore 1/3, that is going to retain the right to vote as everybody else loses it, and we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I think also Nancy's right that I guess I'm reminded, people were looking for historical examples. I'm thinking a lot about the message of the New Deal in the wake of the most recent election, where a lot of people talked about, well, do we appeal to people about democracy? Are people going to be motivated by defending democracy, or do they want to have these sort of bread and butter issues addressed? And it strikes me that the New Deal, the point of the New Deal and the success of the New Deal was rooted on the idea that people need to be convinced that democracy is essential to addressing those bread and butter issues. And so if Democrats can't deliver on the bread and butter issues, they can't ask people to defend democracy. It's, that's not going to motivate people. I want to give some recognition to Bob's question about strikes and boycotts. And I think, absolutely, I think we need to think of ourselves as, I mean, faculty and students and academic workers are the people who have the interests and the values of our institutions at heart. And if that means that we need to withdraw our labor to defend those values, I think we need to do that. But I think we also need to be in the position that we can actually sustain those actions. And that takes a lot of prior organizing and hard work. I think everybody on this call knows.
Yeah. Well, thank you all panelists.
Danielle has her hand up. I don't know if...
Yeah, I know we're running out of time really quickly, but I just wanted to emphasize something I put in the chat. And first of all, thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your thoughts and your work. But if we underplay or don't talk enough about race, and race in particular, I am very concerned that we're going to end up right here again. And I'm reminded of people who tried to make entryways into mainstream media, like Dr. Eddie Glaude, and the hard time he had on MSNBC because no one wanted to talk about race. And I know the importance of intersectionality, that gender always matters. I get all of that, class, everything. But there's a history in this country of just kind of, not digging into race. And race is just so important. It's ever present. It is here. We can't just relegate race to a small group of people, because that's how we get here. It's so ever present. So I just want to say that. I had to say that out loud. Just the written word didn't do it enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. And can I say too, another group to really pay attention to in all this is the African American Policy Forum, founded by Kimberly Crenshaw. They have been leading on so much of this, and exactly what you're saying, Danielle, like from the very beginning when this whole critical race theory attack from Christopher Rufo came down, the attacks on Claudine Gay, all of it. They've been, Kimberly Crenshaw is brilliant. Just look for videos, from her on this, but also they have led in fighting the book bans. They're a key part of the Freedom to Learn Coalition. So I'm really glad that you raised that. And I think they've really modeled how to show and explain to people that you can't save democracy without addressing racism, right? And without fighting back against it.
Thank you, Danielle. My final question, if we had time, is what have we not talked about? And I think, Danielle, you answered that question without it being asked. So I appreciate everybody's perspective here. I wish we had more time. We set for ourselves a 90-minute session. I want to thank Dr. Crystal Moten and Faith Ann Bennett for their work putting this together. Thank you both. This was a fantastic session. Thanks to our panelists, Will, Felicia, Nancy, and Paul. Tremendous. You know, I think the thing that gives me hope is this community right here in this moment, because we have each other. We have this deep knowledge of history and struggle. And we're all people who, by virtue of studying working people's history, we're used to setbacks, but also recoveries. And so we'll be looking ahead for the fight back that I do believe will be emerging. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Oh, Eileen, before we go, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if Crystal wanted to have a last word about
Oh, yes.
upcoming
Thank
events.
you.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry,
Sure.
Crystal.
That's
No,
okay.
no. This
I
has
won't
been
say
such a
what my comment was. You know,
this is
loving
such a
to
fabulous
do this.
discussion. I didn't want it to end. So just we will be in touch with you about our upcoming events, which will include 2 book talks that will be happening later this semester. And then also we are going to be planning works in progress sessions. And so if you have any interest in presenting work that is in progress, it could be in the form of an article, an op-ed, an exhibit proposal, 15 pages or less, we will be interested and including you in a works in progress session. Or if you want to comment on works in progress, we will be there's a form in the chat that you can fill out to indicate your interest that will aid us in our planning. We'll send this all out by email so that you don't have to rush and fill out forms now, but be on the lookout for additional events, the book talk events, and then our works in progress sessions. And so just thank you again for joining us for this wonderful and important, timely discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal, and hope to see you all at our conference in June in Chicago, June 12th to 14th.
Yeah.
Take care all.
Absolutely. Thank you.